The chamber froze as Jasmine Crockett calmly slid a folder across the table. Inside, a DNA revelation tied directly to Donald Trump. For 47 agonizing seconds, he said nothing. Then came the undickable plea. Cut the cameras. What truth was so explosive it nearly silenced a former president on live TV? Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The chamber was hushed, yet electric, as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett lifted a slim folder from the stack in front of her. The air itself seemed to stiffen, every head turning toward her with a mix of curiosity and dread. Her voice came steady, deliberate, and impossibly calm. "Mr. President," she said, fixing her gaze on Donald Trump, "would you like to explain why your DNA shows up in sealed federal records?" The words landed like a thunderclap, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. The cameras reacted instantly, lenses snapping tighter, screens flickering in homes across America. Millions of viewers leaned forward as Trump froze in his seat, his lips parted, his hands fumbled with the edges of his notes, but nothing emerged. Silence filled the chamber. 47 long, suffocating seconds, where the former president, known for bombast and unshakable confidence, could only sit immobilized. In those moments, the weight of what Crockett had said bore down on every person watching, from the polished senators on the dais to the families on couches in small-town living rooms. When the silence finally cracked, it wasn't with a rebuttal or a joke. It came in a strained, panicked burst, his voice cutting across the tension. "Turn them off! Cut the cameras!" The plea ricocheted against the marble walls, raw and frantic. For a man who had built his empire on commanding the spotlight, this was the unmasking of desperation. The shockwave carried through televisions and phones, lighting up group chats, triggering frantic calls, filling social media with disbelief. People who had sworn they had seen it all were left speechless, fingers racing to capture the moment. Crockett did not flinch. Her posture remained straight, her tone unyielding. She leaned just enough toward the microphone so her words carried with chilling clarity. "The evidence doesn't disappear because you want the cameras off." The line sliced through the chamber, transforming what had been a spectacle into something darker, something historic. Crockett's demand hung unanswered, his silence louder than any denial could ever be. The country sat suspended in that cliffhanger, aware that the confrontation had only just begun, and the truth would not be so easily contained. Jasmine Crockett did not stumble into this moment by accident. Her rise from Texas courtrooms to the halls of Congress was built on a reputation for sharpness, precision, and timing that bordered on surgical. Long before she ever held a seat in the House, she was known in legal circles for a single habit. She never asked a question she didn't already know the answer to. Colleagues described her cross-examinations as defendants and witnesses would step onto what looked like firm ground, only to realize, too late, that the floor had been yanked from beneath them. That skill translated seamlessly into politics. Crockett built her career not by shouting the loudest, but by knowing when to let silence do the talking. The way she could pause, fix her opponent with a steady stare, and wait until their own words betrayed them, was a tactic honed in countless trials. It was also what gave her credibility among constituents who were exhausted by empty rhetoric. She was not a politician who trafficked in spin. She was a lawyer who trafficked in receipts, and she carried that training with her like armor. For Crockett, truth was not an accessory to power, it was the very foundation of it. She had said in countless interviews, "If your case is weak, the truth will expose it. If your case is strong, the truth is your sharpest weapon." That ethos drove her decision-making. When she stood in that chamber with a folder in her hand, she wasn't improvising. She was delivering a move that had been mapped out weeks earlier, calculated to land with maximum effect at the exact moment the cameras could not look away. The decision to reveal DNA evidence was not born of political theater alone. It was the culmination of months of careful review, sleepless nights with her staff poring over sealed documents, and the knowledge that once she spoke those words aloud, there would be no turning back. She knew the risks: accusations of overreach, threats to her safety, the inevitable firestorm of media attacks. But Crockett also knew the stakes, to her. Withholding the truth when the evidence was clear would be a betrayal of her oath and a betrayal of the people who trusted her to stand fearless in the face of power. Her belief that truth is not negotiable was more than a line for cameras. It was a personal code. She grew up in communities where lies from the powerful had life or death consequences, where people paid for political spin with real suffering. That memory was carved into her approach. The timing of her revelation was deliberate, not for shock value alone, but to remind the country that facts, when unveiled at the right moment, could still shake the unshakable. And in that chamber, with Trump frozen and America holding its breath, Crockett proved her precision could break through even the thickest walls of bluster. Donald Trump's entire public life had been engineered around the idea of dominance. From the early days of tabloid headlines to the dizzying heights of the Oval Office, he cultivated an image that projected power, unpredictability, and command. He understood that in a media-driven age, perception could often outpace substance, and he mastered the art of keeping audiences guessing. In rallies, debates, and hearings, he made unpredictability a strategy. One could never be entirely sure if he would crack a joke, launch an insult, or bulldoze the conversation with sheer force of personality. This cultivated persona gave him the ability to bend traditional settings into theaters of his own making. In congressional hearings, what should have been solemn proceedings often turned into spectacles once he entered the frame. He had a knack for redirecting attention, mocking opponents, and turning the spotlight back onto himself. To his supporters, it was proof of strength, a leader who could never be cornered. To his critics, it was chaos masquerading as confidence. Either way, Trump wielded the performance as both shield and sword. That strategy had served him well for years. Even in his most embattled moments, during impeachments, investigations, or televised interrogations, he seemed to thrive on confrontation, using noise and bravado to overwhelm precision. The louder the clash, the easier it was for him to blur the lines of truth and distract from the substance at hand. But beneath the roar, there was an unspoken gamble. As long as the confrontation stayed in the realm of spin and perception, Trump could always dominate the stage. What he was not prepared for, however, was a confrontation where theater could not mask the facts. DNA evidence, with its cold clarity, did not bend to slogans or insults. It carried a weight that showmanship could not erase. And in that hearing room, the persona Trump had carefully crafted for decades, the unflappable, commanding figure who always controlled the stage, collided with something unspinnable. The performance tools he had relied on were suddenly useless. Jokes fell flat in silence. Insults would have sounded hollow against the gravity of sealed federal records. The foreshadowing was clear even before Crockett's words landed. Observers noticed how Trump seemed restless in the hours leading up to the confrontation, shuffling papers, leaning heavily on his familiar tactics of disdain and dismissal. Yet when the question finally came, direct, precise, and backed by evidence, his persona fractured. The man who had always defined the stage now found himself pleading to cut the cameras, a move that stripped away the illusion of control he had spent decades projecting. That clash between showmanship and raw, undeniable science was the very crux of the moment. Trump's persona, built on dominance, collided head-on with Crockett's commitment to precision. And in those 47 seconds of silence, the truth proved more commanding than any performance ever could. The moment arrived without warning, yet with the inevitability of a storm that had been building for weeks. The hearing chamber, already thick with tension, seemed to freeze when Jasmine Crockett slid the slim folder across the polished desk. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words landed with the clarity of a gavel strike. "Mr. President, would you like to explain why your DNA shows up in sealed federal records?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Trump blinked, once, twice, his jaw tightening as though the muscles in his face were rebelling. The camera zoomed in instinctively, hunting for the flicker of reaction, and found it, the flush rising in his cheeks. "That's fake," he finally stammered, the familiar bluster sounding suddenly hollow. "It's phony, a hoax, like everything else you people come up with." But Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on him, steady, unyielding. "The sealed lab results don't lie," she said, her tone crisp but almost surgical in its restraint. "You've built a career on calling facts fake, but facts remain even when you shout over them. This evidence does not vanish just because you say so. The gallery behind them erupted in low murmurs. Aides shuffled in their seats, craning their necks toward the folder as if it might burst into flames. Trump's supporters bristled, their faces tightening, but none dared to interrupt. This wasn't speculation or innuendo. It was science, sealed and certified, now thrust into the blinding light of public scrutiny. Trump tried to recover, leaning forward with that familiar sneer, his voice dropping into the rhythm he had used countless times to overwhelm critics. You don't even know what you're talking about. You're a lightweight, a total lightweight, reading lies someone slipped you. Nobody believes this nonsense. Yet the more he spoke, the clearer it became that his voice was straining against the weight of the evidence. Crockett didn't match his volume. She didn't need to. Her calm restraint only magnified the imbalance. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, sir," she replied. "And the American people will too. This isn't theater, this is evidence. Evidence that links your DNA to records you swore under oath did not exist." The line hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. It was no longer a contest of wills or personalities. It was fact versus denial, precision versus bluster. The reveal had shattered the rhythm Trump relied upon, and for the first time in years, the room no longer bent to his performance. It bent to the truth. What followed was not a typical pause. It was not the dramatic silence of a man gearing up for a counterattack. It was a collapse in real time, captured by every lens in the chamber. 47 seconds. That's how long Donald Trump sat at the witness table without words. At first, it looked like a stall, the way he often leaned back to bait his critics into overplaying their hand. But as the seconds ticked by, the silence transformed into something else. He gripped the edge of the desk so tightly that his knuckles whitened. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came. A bead of sweat traced a path from his temple down his cheek, betraying the strain. The room itself seemed to lean in, everyone watching the spectacle of silence. Aides shifted uncomfortably, one nervously tapping a pen against a notepad. His lawyers leaned forward, whispering frantically, but he didn't turn his head. His eyes darted once toward the cameras, then back to the folder sitting in front of him like a ticking bomb. Outside the chamber, social media ignited. Phones buzzed across the country as clips of the pause began circulating in real time. 47 seconds of silence, one journalist tweeted, attaching a video that would rack up millions of views before the hearing even ended. Another commentator whispered into a hot mic, "This is history in motion. This is the moment." The silence wasn't empty. It was loud with meaning. Every second extended the spectacle, each tick of the clock underscoring the fact that Trump, the man who always had a retort, who thrived on quick jabs and endless words, was cornered. For decades he had wielded words like weapons, but here he sat, stripped of them, his arsenal useless against the hard weight of DNA evidence. Observers would later describe it as the longest 47 seconds of his career. In living rooms across America, families leaned forward towards their televisions. In offices, people stopped working, watching streams on their phones, eyes wide as the silence stretched into eternity. For some, it was vindication, for others, disbelief. But no one could deny the spectacle of power unraveling in real time. When Trump finally shifted in his seat, muttering half-formed words under his breath, the spell was broken. But the damage was done. The 47 seconds would be replayed endlessly, dissected by analysts, etched into memory as the moment's silence spoke louder than anything he could say. The eruption, when it came, was volcanic. Trump slammed his hand against the desk, the echo ricocheting through the chamber. His face was crimson, his voice rising with the desperation of a man who had lost control of the stage. "Turn them off," he barked, gesturing wildly at the cameras. "Turn them off right now! I said cut the cameras!" The command shocked even his closest aides. Never before had he so nakedly begged for the very spotlight he once thrived under to be extinguished. Staffers scrambled, half rising from their seats, unsure whether to obey or to freeze. Technicians exchanged panicked glances, waiting for a signal from above. But the cameras kept rolling, red lights glowing like unblinking eyes, capturing every second. Crockett, still seated with the same poise she had carried from the start, did not raise her voice to compete with his outburst. Instead, she allowed his desperation to fill the room until it became deafening. When she finally spoke, her words sliced clean through the chaos. "America deserves to see this," she said, her tone calm, almost gentle but unyielding. "The truth doesn't stop because you demand the cameras off. The evidence does not disappear when you look away." The chamber gasped audibly. The contrast was cinematic, Trump's eruption against Crockett's steadiness, fire against stone. The optics were undeniable. The former president flailing, the Congresswoman unflinching. Every network carried it live, anchors whispering in disbelief as the moment unfolded before them. Trump, still raging, repeated himself, his voice cracking now. "This is unfair. It's a setup. Turn them off, I said." But the desperation was a betrayal of his image, a glimpse behind the curtain. For years he had presented himself as untouchable, always in command, never rattled. And here he was, pleading with television crews to cut the feed, as if silencing the cameras could erase the folder sitting in plain sight. In homes across America, the scene resonated like a thunderclap. Parents called their children into the room. Strangers messaged one another. "Are you seeing this?" Commentators later described it as a political earthquake, a rupture in the narrative Trump had constructed around himself. No clever line or biting insult could undo the optics of that moment. The cameras stayed on, the red lights burned, and Crockett leaned back in her chair, her calm a living contrast to the chaos unraveling across from her. "The evidence stands, Mr. President," she said, one final time, "and the American people will see it for themselves." The plea had been made, the cameras had stayed rolling, and in that clash, between desperate silence and steadfast truth, the confrontation was sealed as one of the most unforgettable in American political history. The confrontation had barely ended before television screens across America lit up with the replay. The clip of Trump gripping the desk, eyes darting, his lips trembling for nearly a full minute, became the new visual shorthand for a shaken empire. Cable networks cut away from scheduled programming to broadcast the footage on a loop. The banner at the bottom of one screen screamed, 40 seconds that shook the senators who for years had navigated Trump's showmanship with varying degrees of skepticism, sounded unified in their astonishment. "We've never seen him this shaken," one declared on CNN. On MSNBC, a panelist leaned forward and said, "It wasn't the outburst that defined tonight, it was the silence. That silence carried more weight than any soundbite he's ever delivered. Even Fox News, usually a fortress of favorable framing, couldn't completely spin it away. Their anchors awkwardly acknowledged the uncharacteristic hesitation, though they tried to drown it with distractions." By midnight, late-night comedy shows had already written their monologues. Trump's desperate plea to cut the cameras became both punchline and prophecy. Audiences roared with laughter when comedians mimicked him clutching the desk, but the laughter quickly turned uneasy when hosts pivoted to the deeper question. What did the DNA evidence mean for the presidency? Comedy gave way to gravity, as monologues shifted from parody to genuine alarm. One host said, "We've joked about circus politics for years, but tonight, this is no joke. DNA evidence is not a skit, it's not a tweet, it's science." Within hours, editorial boards across the nation published emergency pieces. The New York Times labeled the hearing, "The night accountability touched power." The Washington Post ran with, "From silence to shouting, a presidency cornered." Clips flooded social media timelines at breakneck speed. On TikTok, teens remixed the 47-second silence into looping soundtracks, overlaying it with captions like, "When you realize DNA doesn't care about politics." On Twitter, journalists and comedians sparred over the gravity of the revelation, but the hashtags became unifying forces. Dion Bombshell Show 47 seconds. Pundits who once thrived on partisan equivocation suddenly sounded more sober. On morning shows the following day, they admitted that no one could ignore the lab results Crockett had introduced. The cameras captured a man who always thrived on controlling the spectacle, finally undone by something beyond his control, one analyst said. Another, on NPR, put it bluntly. For the first time, truth didn't negotiate with him. Truth won. For Crockett, the moment required no press conference, no spin. Her silence after the reveal had been enough. The cameras carried her poise across every channel, every platform. She didn't need to add to the eruption because the eruption spoke for itself. The media had crowned its new protagonist, and the contrast could not have been starker. If the media amplified the moment, the public made it unforgettable. By dawn, conversations in schools, diners, churches, and workplaces revolved around a single question: did you see it? Teachers whispered about it in hallways before first bell. In coffee shops, strangers leaned across tables to trade reactions. Families sat around breakfast tables, replaying the footage on their phones, unable to believe what they had seen. At a diner in Ohio, a waitress balanced coffee cups while muttering, 47 seconds, can you imagine? Him, silent? Patrons nodded, shaking their heads in disbelief. In a Houston barbershop, customers debated whether it was the silence or the outburst to cut the cameras that would haunt him more. 47's weakness, one man argued. Another countered, no, it was the cameras. That's the moment America saw him begging to turn the truth off. Trump's supporters scrambled for footing. Online forums swirled with defensive refrains. It's a setup. Fake labs. Deep state science. Yet even among loyalists, the refrain carried less conviction than before. The footage was raw, unedited, and impossible to dismiss. DNA wasn't rhetoric, it was evidence. Even those desperate to believe him found themselves whispering doubts in quieter corners. But DNA doesn't lie, one woman said in a church basement after Bible study, her words met with uneasy silence. Independents and moderates, often fatigued by years of political whiplash, felt a different stir. To them, Crockett's composure represented something rare: clarity. She didn't even gloat, a retired veteran in Florida told his neighbors. That's how you know it was real. She let the evidence speak. For many in the political middle, the confrontation became a catalyst. They didn't see spin, they saw fact. And the fact had landed like a hammer. Social media magnified these grassroots reactions. Hashtags skyrocketed. Not D in the bombshell, 47 seconds, cut the cameras. Instagram feeds filled with side-by-side memes of Trump once thundering about dominating the stage and now shrinking into silence. TikTok creators stitched reactions of teams, pastors, even nurses on overnight shifts, each saying some version of, I didn't believe it at first, but then I saw. Churches on Sunday struggled to navigate it. Some pastors avoided the topic, fearing division. Others invoked it directly. In a church outside Atlanta, a pastor told his congregation, if the truth shakes the powerful, maybe that's what it's meant to do. Congregants murmured agreement, some clapping, others sitting in stunned quiet. Polling agencies scrambled to capture the shift. Overnight surveys showed independent voters moving by double digits in their impressions. Focus groups revealed a single recurring theme: we can forgive mistakes, we can't forgive lies, exposed by science. The findings sent shivers through campaign operatives who understood the implications far beyond one hearing. The public reaction wasn't uniform, but it was seismic. For years, Trump had turned controversy into loyalty, outrage into applause. But this time, the script faltered. The laughter from late-night shows, the whispers in diners, the hashtags exploding online, all pointed to a singular truth. This wasn't just a political hit. It was a cultural rupture. America had seen him cornered, and once seen, it could not be unseen. As the public digested the shock, Washington's machinery groaned into motion. Congressional committees wasted no time. By the next morning, staffers were drafting subpoenas for the DNA evidence. Lawmakers who had once tiptoed around the subject now found themselves cornered by their own constituents' questions. What are you doing about it? Town halls demanded. The machinery of accountability, so often stalled, sputtered forward under the weight of undeniable proof. Legal scholars flooded the airwaves, parceling every angle. Some argued it was precedent-shattering. Never before had DNA evidence entered the conversation against a former president in such a direct way. Others said it was long overdue accountability, the natural result of years of evasion finally colliding with science. Law schools even held impromptu panels, professors lecturing students on the historical gravity of the moment. We are watching not just a presidency, but an era being tested, one declared. Even allies began hedging. Interviews with Republican lawmakers revealed subtle but significant cracks. Gone was the unqualified defense. Instead, phrases like, if proven true, and we'll have to see what the committees determine, peppered their remarks. One prominent senator, usually a staunch defender, told a reporter, I can't comment on sealed lab results I haven't reviewed. The evasion spoke louder than loyalty. For the first time, even his defenders feared the political cost of defending him outright. Behind closed doors, aides panicked. Leaked memos revealed strategy sessions scrambling for messaging that could blunt the damage. Yet every draft returned to the same wall: science. They could spin motives, question labs, accuse Crockett of partisanship, but they could not erase the footage of the man himself, silenced, then begging to cut the cameras. No strategy could unring that bell. Meanwhile, Crockett's colleagues rallied around her. Many had respected her long before this moment, but now they treated her as a figure who had broken through the fog of spectacle. One senior lawmaker told her quietly in the hall, "You didn't just win a hearing, you gave us something to stand on." Her staff, overwhelmed by messages of support, struggled to keep up with requests for interviews, statements, and appearances. But Crockett herself refused to chase the spotlight. Her focus remained steady. Let the institutions do their work. The institutional ripples extended beyond Congress. Prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions began reviewing whether the DNA evidence intersected with their ongoing investigations. Court filings referenced the hearing obliquely, suggesting that new motions might be introduced. The legal world buzzed with speculation. Was this the evidence that would finally pierce the armor of deflection? Internationally, headlines captured the spectacle with both shock and gravity. European papers ran with variations of "America's reckoning," while commentators in Asia remarked that it revealed the vulnerability of even the most powerful when faced with fact. Foreign leaders, usually cautious in commenting on domestic U.S. drama, quietly noted that trust in American institutions might actually be reinforced by this moment of exposure. By the week's end, it was clear. This was no passing story. It had shifted from spectacle to structure, from a viral clip to institutional consequence. Trump had always thrived in the fog of performance, but institutions were built on permanence. The subpoenas, the legal panels, the hedging allies, all signaled that permanence had caught up with him. The comeback wasn't Crockett speaking louder or striking harder. It was the eruption of reality across every layer: media, public, and institution, showing that truth, once unleashed, could not be contained. The morning after the confrontation, campuses across the country erupted in a way that felt eerily reminiscent of historic protest eras. At Howard University, a group of law students set up a sit-in in the main atrium. Their signs were bold and cutting: "Science doesn't blink, truth has no party," and 47 seconds equals accountability. Professors, normally cautious, allowed classes to pause as students streamed into courtyards, microphones in hand, chanting about the power of evidence in a democracy. Similar scenes unfolded at Berkeley, Columbia, and state colleges in the South and Midwest, turning the DNA revelation into a cultural flashpoint. At the same time, living rooms and kitchen tables across America became battlegrounds of conversation. A retired veteran in Ohio told his grandchildren, "DNA doesn't lie. It put killers behind bars when nothing else could. Why should a president be different?" In contrast, a Trump-supporting family in Alabama argued bitterly, the father pounding the table and insisting, "It's a setup. They'll do anything to take him down." The teenage daughter, scrolling TikTok clips of the 47-second silence, shot back, "Then why didn't he answer? Why did he beg to cut the cameras?" The fight wasn't just in courtrooms or on TV screens. It was fracturing families. Meanwhile, civic groups saw an opening. The American Association for Scientific Integrity launched a campaign called Truth in Evidence, buying billboards that read, "Justice doesn't fear DNA." High school science teachers incorporated the debate into lesson plans, asking students, "What does evidence mean in a democracy?" Youth activists picked it up as a generational banner, arguing that the fight for climate, voting rights, and now presidential accountability was bound together by one principle: evidence over rhetoric. Pop culture amplified the message. Musicians slipped references into lyrics. Comedians joked about the DNA test Maury Povich never saw coming, but under the laughter ran a current of seriousness. Hashtags like DNE Bombshell and Science Speaks didn't just trend, they stayed. Viral TikToks stitched Crockett's calm line, "The evidence doesn't disappear because you want the cameras off," into song remixes, garnering millions of views. The cultural fallout wasn't just noise, it was pressure. It taught young voters, suburban parents, and disengaged citizens that this wasn't abstract politics. It was a test of whether truth, even when uncomfortable, could hold power accountable. While campuses and communities debated the meaning of Crockett's revelation, Washington was in full scramble mode. Trump's donors, the lifeblood of his influence, panicked. Wealthy contributors phoned campaign staffs demanding answers. Is it real? Others quietly froze their donations, unwilling to risk being associated with a scandal tied to scientific proof. At the same time, grassroots fundraising for reform-minded candidates surged. Act Blue reported its single biggest one-day spike since the 2020 election, fueled by donors who captioned their contributions with notes like, "For Jasmine, for the truth." Capitol Police, wary of threats, doubled Crockett's security detail. Anonymous online forums bristled with calls for retaliation, and officials weren't taking chances. Crockett, however, moved undeterred. She told aides, "If they fear truth this much, it means we're finally hitting the core." On Capitol Hill, committee chairs scrambled to adjust agendas. Within days, bipartisan hearings were announced under the title, DNA, Chain of Custody and Presidential Accountability. For the first time in years, Republicans and Democrats agreed that no matter their loyalty to Trump, the credibility of science was non-negotiable. Behind closed doors, GOP strategists fretted. "We can't spin DNA. If this holds, we're finished." Legal scholars weighed in, writing op-eds that framed the moment as a potential turning point in constitutional history. One Georgetown professor argued, "We have spent decades debating executive privilege, but never the privilege to erase science." Another from Stanford declared it precedent-shattering. If evidence ties a sitting president to undisclosed investigations, the firewall of power is breached. Trump's allies found themselves cornered in interviews. Some repeated the line, "witch hunt," but when pressed with the words "sealed federal lab results," their rehearsed defiance faltered. One senator stumbled on live TV, I think we should wait and see the full report." Even that hesitation sent shockwaves, signaling fractures in the once unbreakable wall of loyalty. The hashtags told the story. Science over spin trended worldwide. In Europe and Asia, international outlets asked, "Can the U.S. presidency survive DNA evidence?" Editorials compared Crockett to historical figures who challenged entrenched power. The image of Trump's 47-second silence replayed on foreign broadcasts as proof that America's internal reckoning had gone global. The political fallout crystallized into a simple, devastating question that haunted every corridor of power. If DNA evidence is the final arbiter in courts of law, why should the presidency be exempt? The chamber that day became more than a hearing room. It became a mirror, reflecting back to America the difference between power that shouts and truth that endures in silence. For 47 seconds, the nation saw something raw, something unscripted. A man who had long relied on bluster, denial, and performance was left with nothing but the weight of evidence pressing down on him. And beside him stood Jasmine Crockett, steady, calm, and unwilling to let intimidation erase fact. Her final words still echo across campuses, churches, newsrooms, and family kitchens. Evidence is the one thing power cannot silence. In that single line, she distilled the meaning of the confrontation. It was not about partisan victory. It was not about one politician embarrassing another. It was about the survival of something more sacred. The idea that facts still matter in a democracy, that no office, no title, no flag draped behind a desk is strong enough to erase the truth written in science. For decades, Americans have argued about policies, parties, and personalities. But what this moment revealed is that the heart of democracy isn't just debate. It's the recognition that evidence must be stronger than any spin. When Crockett refused to let the cameras be cut, she wasn't just challenging one man's attempt to hide. She was defending the public's right to see, to judge, and to decide for themselves. And in that refusal, she lit a spark that will continue to burn in classrooms, in courts, and in every future hearing where truth is on trial. The story of that silence, those 47 seconds, will be told again and again. Teachers will point to it as the instant when science met politics and forced accountability into the open. Journalists will cite it as the pivot when even allies of power had to stammer and stall, unable to explain away DNA evidence. Families will remember it as the dinner table debate that could not be resolved with slogans, only with honesty. And future leaders will remember that if a president can be shaken by facts, then no one is untouchable when truth finally arrives. That is why this story does not end with the confrontation. It ends with us, with every citizen willing to say that truth must outlive fear, that democracy must bend toward evidence, and that silence, in the face of fact, is not leadership but surrender. The system was tested, it bent under pressure, but it did not break, because one voice stood firm and reminded us that cameras once rolling belonged to the people, not to power. So if you believe that truth is stronger than spin, if you believe that evidence must speak louder than politics, then join us. Subscribe, share this story, and stand with those who refuse to let silence bury fact, because when evidence speaks, history listens.